Chapter 2 of Adventures of Bindle by Herbert Jenkins. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 2 A Downing Street Sensation. "Me ride 8 miles on an 'orse!" exclaimed Bindle, looking up at the foreman in surprise. "And 'oo's a comin' to 'old me on?" Bindle stood in the yard of Messrs. Impson and Daly, cartage contractors, regarding a pair of burly cart horses, ready harnessed, with the traces thrown over their backs. The foreman explained in the idiom adopted by foremen that orders is orders. "You can ride on top, run beside, or 'ang on be'ind, but you gotta be at Merton at 12 o'clock," he said. "We just 'ad a telephone message that a van's stranded this side o' Merton, 'orses broken down, and you and Tippet 'ave got to take these 'ere and deliver the goods. Then take the van where you're told, and bring back them ruddy 'orses 'ere, and don't you forget it." Bindle scratched his head through the blue and white cricket cap he habitually wore. Horses had suddenly assumed for him a new significance. With elaborate intentness he examined the particular animal that had been assigned to him. "Wot part d'you sit on, ole son?" he enquired of Tippet, a pale, weedy youth, with a thin dark moustache that curled into the corners of his mouth. Tippet's main characteristic was that he always had a cigarette either stuck to his lip or behind his ear, sometimes both. "On 'is tail," replied Tippet laconically, his cigarette wagging up and down as he spoke. "Sit on 'is wot?" cried Bindle, walking round to the stern of his animal and examining the tail with great attention. "Sit on 'is wot?" "On 'is tail," repeated Tippet, without manifesting any interest in the conversation. "Right back on 'is 'aunches," he added by way of explanation. "More comfortable." "Oh!" said Bindle, relieved. "I see. Pity you can't say wot you mean, Tippy, ain't it? Personally, myself, I'd sooner sit well up so as I could put me arms round 'is neck. Hi, Spotty," he called to an unprepossessing stable hand, "bring a ladder." What?" enquired Spotty dully. "A ladder," explained Bindle. "I got to mount this 'ere Derby winner." Spotty strolled leisurely across the yard towards Bindle, and for a moment stood regarding the horse in a detached sort of way. "I'll give you a leg up, mate," he said accommodatingly. Bindle looked at the horse suspiciously, and seeing there were no indications of vice, at the same time realising that there was nothing else to be done, he acquiesced. "Steady on, ole sport," he counselled Spotty. "Don't you chuck me clean over the other side." With a dexterous heave, Spotty landed him well upon the animal's back. Bindle calmly proceeded to throw one leg over, sitting astride. "Not that way," said Tippet. "Both legs on the near side." "You can ride your nag what way you like, Tippy," said Bindle, "but as for me, I likes to have a leg on each side. 'Ow the 'ell am I going to 'old on if I sit like a bloomin' lady? My God!" he exclaimed, passing his hand along the backbone of the animal. "If I don't 'ave a cushion I shall wear through in 2 licks. 'Ere, Spotty, give us a cloth o' some sort, then you can back me as a 2 to 1 chance." Tippet, more accustomed than Bindle to such adventures, vaulted lightly upon his animal, and led the way out of the yard. For some distance they proceeded at an ambling walk, which Bindle found in no way inconvenient. Just as they had entered the Fulham Road, where it branches off from Brompton Road, an urchin gave Bindle's horse a flick on the flank with a stick, sending it into a ponderous trot, amidst the jangle and clatter of harness. Bindle clutched wildly at the collar. "'Ere, stop 'im, somebody! 'Old 'im!" he yelled. "I touched the wrong button. Whoa, steady! Whoa, old iron!" he shouted. Then turning his head to one side he called out, "Tippy, Tippy, where the 'ell is the brake? For Gawd's sake stop 'im before he shakes me into a jelly." Tippet's animal jangled up beside that on which Bindle was mounted, and both once more fell back into the ponderous lope at which they had started. With great caution Bindle raised himself into an upright position. "I wonder wot made 'im do a thing like that," he said reproachfully. "Bruised me all over, 'e 'as. I shan't be able to sit down for a month. 'Ere, stop 'im, Tippy, I'm gettin' orf." Tippet stretched out his hand and brought both horses to a standstill. Bindle slipped ungracefully over his animal's tail. "You can 'ave 'im, Tippy, ole sport. I'm goin' to walk," he announced. "When I get tired o' walkin', I'll get on a bus. I'll meet you at Wimbledon Common," and Tippet, his cigarette hanging loosely from a still looser lower lip, reached over, caught the animal's bridle, and, without comment, continued on his way westward. "Well, live and learn," mumbled Bindle to himself. "I don't care what a jockey gets, but he earns it, every penny. Fancy an 'orse bein' as 'ard as that. Catch you up presently, Tippy," he cried. "Mind you don't fall orf," and Bindle turned into the Dragon Hounds "for something to take the bruises out," as he expressed it to himself. "Catch me a ridin' of an 'orse again without an air cushion," he muttered as he came out of the public bar wiping his mouth. He hailed a west-bound bus and, climbing on the top and lighting his pipe, proceeded to enjoy the morning sunshine. When Tippet reached the extreme end of Wimbledon Common, Bindle rose from the grass by the roadside where he had been leisurely smoking and enjoying the warmth. "'Ad quite a pleasant little snooze, Tippy," he yawned, as he stretched his arms behind his head. "Wonder who first thought o' ridin' on an 'orse's back," he yawned. "As for me, I'd jest as soon ride on an 'and saw." They jogged along in the direction of Merton, Bindle walking beside the horses, Tippet silent and apathetic, his cigarette still attached to his lower lip. "You ain't wot I should call a chatty cove, Tippy," remarked Bindle conversationally. "But then," he added, "that 'as its points. If you don't open your mouth, no woman can't say you ever asked 'er to marry you, can she?" "Married, mate?" Tippet vouchsafed the information without expression or interest. Bindle stood still and looked at him. Tippet unconcernedly continued on his way. "Well, I'm damned!" remarked Bindle as he continued after the horses. "Well, I'm damned! They'd get you if you was deaf and dumb and blind. Pore old Tippy, no wonder 'e looks like that." Just outside Merton they came upon a stranded pantechnicon. Drawn up in front of it was a motor car containing two ladies. "This the little lot?" enquired Bindle as they pulled up beside the vehicle which bore the name of John Smith and Company, Merton. "Are you all from Empson and Daly's?" enquired the elder of the two ladies, a sallow faced, angular woman with pince nez. "That's us, mum," responded Bindle. "I suppose those are the horses," remarked the same lady, indicating the animals with an inclination of her head. "You ain't got much to learn in the way o' guessin', mum," was Bindle's cheery response. The lady eyed him disapprovingly. Her companion at the wheel smiled. She was younger. Bindle winked at her, but she froze instantly. "The horses that were in this van were taken ill," said the lady. "Wot, both together, mum?" exclaimed Bindle. "Yes," replied the lady, looking at him sharply. "Must 'ave been twins or conchies." Footnote: conscientious objectors to military service. Was Bindle's explanation of the phenomenon. "If one o' Ginger's twins 'as the measles, sure as eggs the other'll get 'em on the next day. That's wot makes Ginger so ratty." Bindle walked up to the van and examined it, as if to assure himself that it was in no way defective. "An' where are we to take it, mum?" he enquired. "To Mr. Llewellyn John, No. 110 Downing Street," was the reply. Bindle whistled. "'E ain't movin', is 'e, mum?" "The van contains a presentation of carved oak dining room furniture," she added. "And very nice too," was Bindle's comment. "Outside Downing Street," she continued, "you will be met by a lady who will give you the key that opens the doors of the van." "'Adn't we better take the key now, mum?" Bindle enquired. "You'll do as you're told, please," was the uncompromising rejoinder. "Right o, mum," remarked Bindle cheerily. "Now then, Tippy, let's get these 'ere 'orses in. Which end d'you begin on?" Tippet and Bindle silently busied themselves in harnessing the horses to the pantechnicon. "Now you won't make any mistake," said the lady when everything was completed. "No. 110 Downing Street, Mr. Llewellyn John." "There ain't goin' to be no mistakes, mum. You may put your 'and on your 'eart," Bindle assured her. "Coffee money, mum?" enquired Tippet. "It's 'ot." Tippet never wasted words. "Tippy, Tippy, I'm surprised at you." Bindle turned upon his colleague reproachfully.
Only twice have you spoke to day, and the second time's to beg. I'm sorry, mum," he said, turning to the lady. "It ain't his fault, it's jest 'habit." The lady hesitated for a moment, then taking her purse from her bag, handed Bindle a 2-shilling piece. Tippet eyed it greedily. With a final admonition not to forget, the lady drove off. Bindle looked at the coin, spat on it, and put it in his pocket. "Funny thing 'ow a woman'll give a couple o' bob, where a man'll make it 'alf a dollar," he remarked. "What about me?" enquired Tippet. "Wot about you, Tippy?" repeated Bindle. "Well, least said, soonest mended. You can't 'elp it." "But I asked 'er," persisted Tippet. "Ah, Tippy," remarked Bindle, "it ain't 'im wot asks, but 'im wot gets. 'Owever, you shall 'ave a stone ginger at the next stoppin' place. Your ole pal ain't going back on you, Tippy." Without a word, Tippet climbed up into the driver's seat, whilst Bindle clambered on to the tailboard, where he proceeded to fill his pipe with the air of a man for whom time has no meaning. "Good job they ain't all like me," he muttered. "I likes a day in the country now and then, but always not me." He struck a match, lighted his pipe, and with a sigh of contentment composed himself to bucolic meditation. One of the advantages of the moving profession in Bindle's eyes was that it gave him hours of leisured ease whilst the goods were in transit. "You can slack it like a Cuthbert," he would say. "All you got to do is sit on the tail of a van and watch the world go by. Some life that." Bindle was awakened from his contemplation of the hedges and the white road that ribboned out before his eyes by a man coming out of a gate. At the sight of the pantechnicon he grinned and, with a jerk of his thumb, indicated the van as if it were the greatest joke in the world. Bindle grinned back, although not quite understanding the cause of the man's amusement. "Up little lot that, mate," remarked the man, stepping off the curb and walking beside the tailboard. Bindle looked at him, puzzled at the remark. "Wot actually might you be meaning, ole son?" he enquired. "Oh, come orf it," said the man. "I won't tell yer missis, like a razzle myself sometimes," and he laughed, obviously amused at this joke. Bindle slipped off the tailboard and joined the man, who had returned to the pavement. "You evidently seen a joke wot's caught me on the blind side," he remarked casually. "A joke," remarked the man. "A whole van load o' jokes, if you was to ask me." "Well, p'raps you're right," remarked Bindle philosophically; "but if there's as many as all that, I should have thought there'd 'ave been enough for two; but, as I say, p'raps you're right. These ain't the times for giving anythink away, although," he added meditatively, "I 'adn't 'eard of their 'aving rationed jokes as well as meat and sugar. We shall be 'aving joke queues soon," he added. "You seem to be a sort o' joke 'og, you do." Bindle turned and regarded his companion with interest. "You mean to say that you don't know wot's inside that there van?" enquired the man incredulously. "Carved oak dinin' room furniture, I been told," replied Bindle indifferently. The man laughed loudly, then turned to Bindle. "You mean to say you don't know that van's full o' gals?" he demanded. "Full o' what?" exclaimed Bindle, coming to a dead stop. His astonishment was too obvious to leave doubt in the man's mind as to its genuineness. "Gals and women," he replied. "Saw 'em gettin' in down the road out of motors. Dressed in white they was, with coloured sashes over their shoulders. Suffragettes, I should say. They didn't see me though," he added. Bindle gave vent to a low, prolonged whistle as he resumed his walk. "'Old me 'Orace!" he cried happily. "Wot'd Mrs. B say if she knew?" Suddenly he paused again and slapped his knee. "Well, I'm damned!" he cried. "A raid, of course." The man looked anxiously up at the blue of the sky. "It's all right," said Bindle reassuringly. "My mistake, it was a bird." A few minutes later the man turned off from the main road. "Hi, Tippy!" Bindle hailed. "Don't you forget that stone ginger at the next dairy." A muttered reply came from Tippet. 5 minutes later he drew up outside a public house on the outskirts of Wimbledon. Bindle took the opportunity of climbing up on the top of the van, where he gained the information he required. Every inch of the roof was perforated. "Air 'oles," he muttered with keen satisfaction. "Air 'oles, as I'm a miserable sinner," and he clambered down and entered the public bar, where he convinced Tippet that his mate should be trusted with money.
When Bindle had drained the last drop of his second pewter, his mind was made up. "Number 110 Downing Street," he muttered. "White dresses and coloured sashes. That's it. Well, Joe Bindle, you can't save the bloomin' British Empire from destruction, but you can save the Prime Minister from having his afternoon nap spoilt, leastwise you can try." "I'm a goin' for a little stroll, Tippy," he remarked as he walked towards the door. "Back in 10 minutes. If you gets lonely, order another pint and put it down to me." "Right o, mate," replied Tippet. Bindle walked along Wimbledon High Street and turned into an oil shop. "D'you keep lamp black?" he enquired of the young woman behind the counter. "Yes," she replied. "How much do you want? We sell it in packets." "Let's 'ave a look at a packet," said Bindle. When he had examined it, he ordered 2 more. "Startin' a minstrel troupe," he confided to the young woman. "But you want burnt cork," she said practically. "Lamp black's greasy, you'll never get it off." "That's jest why I want it," remarked Bindle with a grin. The young woman looked at him curiously, and, when he had purchased a pea puffer as well, she decided that he was a harmless lunatic, but took the precaution of testing the half-crown he tendered by ringing it on the counter. "Shouldn't be surprised if we was to 'ave an 'eavy shower of rain in a few minutes," remarked Bindle loudly a few minutes later as he rejoined Tippet, who was engaged in watering the horses. Tippet looked at Bindle, his cigarette wagging. Then, turning his eyes up to the cloudless sky, in surprise, he finally reached the same conclusion as the young woman in the oil shop. "Now up you get, Tippy," admonished Bindle, "and there's another drink for you at the Green Lion." Bindle knew his London. As the pantechnicon rumbled heavily along by the side of Wimbledon Common, Bindle whistled softly to himself the refrain of "The End of a Happy Day." Whilst Tippet was enjoying his 4th pint that morning at the Green Lion, Bindle borrowed a large watering can, which was handed up to him on the roof of the pantechnicon by a surprised barman. Bindle emptied the contents of one of the packets of lamp black into the can, and started to stir it vigorously with a piece of twig he had picked up from the side of the common. When the water had reluctantly absorbed the lamp black, to Bindle's entire satisfaction, he called out loudly, "I knew we was goin' to 'ave a shower," and he proceeded to water the top of the pantechnicon. "Now I must put this 'ere tarpaulin over, or else the water'll get through them 'oles," he said. He clearly heard suppressed exclamations as the water penetrated inside the van. Having emptied the can, he proceeded to drag the tarpaulin over the roof, leaving uncovered only a small portion in the centre. The barman of the Green Lion had been watching Bindle with open-mouthed astonishment. "What the 'ell are you up to, mate?" he whispered. Bindle put his forefinger of the right hand to the side of his nose and winked mysteriously. Then, going inside the Green Lion, he, in a way that did not outrage the regulations that there should be no treating, had Tippet's tankard refilled, and called for another for himself. "If you watch the papers," Bindle remarked to the barman, "I shouldn't be surprised if you was to see wot I was a doin' on the top o' that there van," and again he winked. The barman looked from Bindle to Tippet, then, touching his forehead with a fugitive first finger, and glancing in the direction of Bindle, made it clear that another was prepared to support the diagnosis of the young woman at the oil shop. Bindle completed the journey on the top of the van, industriously occupied in puffing lamp black through the holes in the roof. His method was to dip the end of the pea puffer in the packet, then insert it in one of the holes and give a sharp puff. This he did half a dozen times in quick succession. Then he would pause for a few minutes to allow the lamp black to settle. He argued that if he puffed it all in at once, it would in all probability choke the occupants. By the time they turned from King's Road into Ebury Street, Bindle's task was accomplished. The lamp black was exhausted. "Victoria Station," he called out loudly to Tippet. "Shan't be long now, mate. Another shower a comin'. Better cover up these bloomin' 'oles," and he drew the tarpaulin over the rest of the roof. "Let 'em stew a bit now," he mumbled to himself. "That'll make 'em 'ot." He had been conscious of suppressed coughing and sneezing from within, which he detected by placing his ear near the holes in the roof. Opposite the Houses of Parliament, a lady came up to Bindle and handed him a key. "This is the key of the pantechnicon," she said loudly. "You are not to undo it until you reach number 110 Downing Street. Do you understand?"
"Right o!" remarked Bindle. "I got it." "Now don't forget," said the lady, and she disappeared swiftly in the direction of Victoria Street. "No, I ain't goin' to forget," murmured Bindle to himself, "an' I shouldn't be surprised if there was others wot ain't goin' to forget either." He watched the lady who had given him the key well out of sight, then slipping off the tail board of the van, he walked swiftly along Whitehall. A few yards south of Downing Street, an inspector of police was meditatively contemplating the flow of traffic north and south. Bindle went up to him. "Pretend that I'm askin' the way, sir. I'm most likely bein' watched. I got a van wot's supposed to contain carved oak furniture for Mr. Llewellyn John, 110 Downing Street. I think it's full o' suffragettes goin' to raid 'im. You get your men round there, the van'll be up in 2 ticks. Now point as if you was showing me Downing Street." The inspector was a man of quick decision, and looking keenly at Bindle decided that he was to be trusted. "Right," he said, then extending an official arm, pointed out Downing Street to Bindle. "Don't hurry," he added. "Right o!" said Bindle. "Joseph Bindle's my name. I'm a special Fulham district." The inspector nodded, and Bindle turned back to the van. A moment later, the inspector strolled leisurely through the archway leading to the Foreign Office. "That's Downing Street on the left," shouted Bindle to Tippet as he came up, much to Tippet's surprise. He was at a loss to account for many things that Bindle had done and said that day. As they turned into Downing Street, Bindle was a little disappointed at finding only 2 constables, but he was relieved, a moment later, by the sight of the inspector to whom he had spoken, hurrying through the archway leading from the Foreign Office. "Where are you going to?" called out the inspector to Tippet, taking no notice of Bindle. Tippet jerked his thumb in the direction of Bindle, who came forward at that moment. "Number 110 Downing Street, sir," responded Bindle. "Some furniture for Mr. Llewellyn John." "Right," said the inspector loudly; "but you'll 'ave to wait a few minutes until the motor car is gone." Bindle winked as a sign of his acceptance of the mythical motor car, and drawing the key of the pantechnicon from his pocket, showed it to the inspector, who, by closing his eyes and slightly bending his head, indicated that he understood. Tippet had decided that everybody was mad this morning. The police inspector's reference to a motor car outside number 110, whereas his eyes told him that there was nothing there but roadway and dust, had seriously undermined his respect for the Metropolitan Police Force. However, it was not his business. He was there to drive the horses, who in turn drew a van to a given spot. There his responsibility ended. After a wait of nearly 10 minutes, the inspector reappeared. "It's all clear now," he remarked. "Draw up." As the pantechnicon pulled up in front of number 110, Bindle glanced up at the house and saw Mr. Llewellyn John looking out of one of the first floor windows. He had evidently been apprised of what was taking place. Bindle noticed that the doors of number 110 and 111 were both ajar. He was, however, a little puzzled at the absence of police. The 2 uniformed constables had been reinforced by 3 others, and there were 2 obviously plain clothes men loitering about. "Now then, Tippy, get ready to lend me a 'and with this 'ere furniture," called out Bindle as he proceeded to insert the key in the padlock that fastened the doors of the van. Tippet, who had climbed down, was standing close to the tail board, facing the doors. With a quick movement, Bindle released the padlock from the hasp, and lifting the bar, stepped aside with an agility that was astonishing. "Votes for women! Votes for women! Votes for women!" Suddenly the placid quiet of Downing Street was shattered. The doors of the pantechnicon were burst open and thrown back upon their hinges, where they shivered as if trembling with fear. From the interior of the van poured such a stream of humanity as Downing Street had never before seen. Following Bindle's lead, the inspector had taken the precaution of stepping aside; but Tippet, unconscious that the van contained anything more aggressive than carved oak furniture, was in the direct line of exit. At the moment the doors flew open, he was in the act of removing his coat, and with his arms entangled in the sleeves, sat down with a suddenness that caused his teeth to rattle and his cigarette to fall from his lower lip. Synchronising with the opening of the doors of the pantechnicon was a short, sharp blast of a police whistle. The effect was magical. Men seemed to pour into Downing Street from everywhere.
From the archway leading to the Foreign Office, up the steps from Green Park, from Whitehall and out of numbers 110 and 111, plain clothes and uniformed police seemed to spring up from everywhere, but no one took any notice of the fall of Tippet. All eyes were fixed upon the human avalanche that was pouring from the inside of the Pantechnicon. For once in its existence, the Metropolitan Police Force was rendered helpless with astonishment. Women they had expected, women they were prepared for, but the extraordinary flood of femininity that cascaded out of the van absolutely staggered them. There were short women and tall women, stout women and thin women, young women and, well, women not so young. The one thing they had in common was a lamp black. It was smeared upon their faces, streaked upon their garments. It had circled their eyes, marked the lines of their mouths, had collected round their nostrils. The heat inside the Pantechnicon had produced the necessary moisture upon the fair faces, and with this the lamp black had formed an unholy alliance. Hats were awry, hair was dishevelled, frocks were limp and bedraggled. The cries of "Votes for Women" that had heralded the triumphant outburst from the van froze upon their lips as the demonstrators caught sight of one another. Each gazed at the others in mute astonishment, whilst Tippet, from his seat in the middle of the roadway, stared, wondering, in a stupid way, whether what he saw was the heat, or the 5 pints of ale he had consumed at Bindle's expense during the morning. The inspector looked at Bindle curiously, and Bindle looked at the inspector with self-satisfaction, whilst the constables discovered that their unhappy anticipation of a rough and tumble with women, a thing they disliked, had been turned into a most delectable comedy. At the first floor window Mr. Llewellyn John watched the scene with keen enjoyment. For a full minute the women stood gazing from one to the other in a dazed fashion. Finally one with stouter heart than the rest shouted, "Votes for women! This is a woman's war!" But there was no answering cry from the ranks. Slowly it dawned upon each and every woman that in all probability she was looking just as ridiculous as those she saw about her. One girl produced a small looking glass from a handbag. She gave one glance into it, and incontinently went into hysterics, flopping down where she stood. The public, conscious that great events were happening in Downing Street, poured into the narrow thoroughfare, and the laughter denied the official police by virtue of discipline was heard on every hand. "Christy minstrels, ain't they?" enquired one youth of another with ponderous humour. It was at that moment that one of them had raised a despairing cry of "Votes for women!" and had received no support. "Votes for women!" remarked one man shrewdly. "Soap for women is what they want." "Fancy comin' out like that, even in war time," commented another. "'Ow'd they get like that?" enquired a third. "You never know them suffragettes," remarked a fourth sagely. "They're always out for doing something different from what's been done before." "Well, they done it this time," commented a little man with grey whiskers. "Enough to make Gawd 'imself ashamed of us, them women is. Bah!" and he spat contemptuously. The inspector felt that the time for action had arrived. Walking up to the unhappy group of 20, he remarked in his most official tone, "You cannot stand about here, you must be moving on." "Moving on? But where?" They looked into each other's eyes mutely. Suddenly an idea seemed to strike them, and they turned instinctively to re-enter the van. But Bindle had anticipated this manoeuvre, and had carefully closed, barred and padlocked the doors. The inspector nodded approval. He had formed a very high opinion of Bindle's powers, although greatly puzzled by the whole business. At a signal from their superior, a number of uniformed constables formed up behind the forlorn band of females, several of whom were in tears. "Move along there, please," they chorused, dexterously splitting up the group into smaller groups, and finally into ones and twos. Thus they were herded towards Whitehall. "Will you call some cabs, please?" said she who was obviously the leader. The inspector shook his head, whereat the woman smacked the face of the nearest constable, obviously with the intention of being arrested. Again the inspector shook his head. He had made up his mind that there should be no arrests that day. Nemesis had taken a hand in the game, and the inspector recognised in her one who was more powerful than the Metropolitan Police Force. Slowly, amidst the jeers of the crowd, the 20 women were shepherded into Whitehall.
"Oh, please get me a taxi," appealed a little blonde woman with a hard mouth and what looked like a dark black moustache. "I cannot go about like this." Suddenly one of their number was taken with shrieking hysterics. She sat down suddenly, giving vent to shriek after shriek, and beating a tattoo with the heels of her shoes upon the roadway; but no one took any notice of her, and soon she rose and followed the others. In Whitehall frantic appeals were made to drivers of taxicabs and conductorettes of omnibuses. None would accept such fares. "It'd take a month to clean my bloomin' cab after you been in it," shouted one man derisively. "What jer want to get yourself in such a dirty mess for?" "Go home and wash the baby," shouted another. Nowhere did the black and white raiders find sympathy or assistance. Two of the leaders of the suffragette movement, who happened to be passing down Whitehall, were attracted by the crowd. On learning what had happened, and seeing the plight of the demonstrators, they continued on their way. "This is war time," one of them remarked to the other, "and they're disobeying the rules of the association." With this they were left to their fate. Some made for the Tube, others for the District Railway, whilst two sought out a tea shop and demanded washing facilities, but were refused. The railway stations were their one source of hope. For the next 3 hours, passengers travelling to Wimbledon were astonished to see entering the train forlorn and dishevelled women, whose faces were rendered hideous by smears of black, and whose white frocks, limp and crumpled, looked as if they had been used to clean machinery. "A pleasant little afternoon's treat for you, sir," remarked Bindle to the inspector when the last of the raiders had disappeared. "Mr. John seemed to enjoy it." Bindle indicated the first floor window of number 110 with a jerk of his thumb. "Was that your doing?" enquired the inspector. "Well," replied Bindle, "it was and it wasn't," and he explained how it had all come about. "And what am I going to do with this 'ere van?" he queried. "Better run it round to the yard, then you can take home the horses," replied the inspector. "Right o!" said Bindle. "By the way," added the inspector, "I'm coming round myself. I should like you to see Chief Inspector Gunny." Bindle nodded cheerily. "'Ullo, Tippy!" he cried. "Knocked you down, didn't they?" Tippet grinned. He had thoroughly enjoyed the entertainment and bore no malice. "That's why you got the watering can, mate?" he remarked. Bindle surveyed him with mock admiration. "Now ain't you clever?" he remarked. "Fancy you a seein' that! There ain't no spots on you, Tippy," whereat Tippet grinned again modestly. That afternoon Bindle was introduced to the famous Chief Inspector Gunny of Scotland Yard, who for years previously had been the head of the department dealing with the suffragist demonstrations. He was a genial, large hearted man, who had earned the respect, almost the liking, of those whose official enemy he was. When he heard Bindle's story he roared with laughter, and insisted that Bindle should himself tell about the black and white raiders to the Deputy Commissioner and the Chief Constable.